to the introduction to our first readings for the 7th week of Easter, which takes us up to the Feast of Pentecost. Today we look at those final chapters of the Acts of the Apostles, but we look at them in quite a compressed way, because in the weekday readings we only get shorter extracts, and we're trying to make up the ground so that on Saturday we finish Acts of the Apostles and we finish Easter time on Pentecost Sunday. We start on Monday with Paul's journey to Ephesus. He travels overland through Galatia and into Ephesus, as he had promised that he would do if the Lord permitted him. In Ephesus he finds many believers there and continues to make many more. We see the effective birth of Christianity in the locale through baptism, conversion, laying on of hands, the gift of the Holy Spirit. And that gift of the Holy Spirit is then expressed in prophecy and in speaking in tongues. Really, Ephesus gives us a highly compressed but very interesting picture of Christian initiation in the early church, particularly amongst Gentile communities. For the Jews, it would have been seen as unimportant because they were continuing to believe in the God that they had always believed in. Because Jesus, don't forget, was a Jew. It's the God who called the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt, who called Abraham to be the father of the nation, who formed them and guided them through the prophets, who is the God of Jesus, who is the God of Paul. But we see that in the birth of Christianity, we get the fact that God is doing something new in the death and resurrection of Jesus and bringing that good news to the whole world. That is what Paul is preaching as he goes out. That's what the dispute we saw a couple of weeks ago at the Council of Jerusalem was all about. Not that the Jews should stop practicing their ancestral ways, but how do you bring in the Gentiles as well? Is it necessary that they become fully Jewish? And we see that Paul then implements the council's decisions. But it will be something that becomes controversial again later in the week as we go through. It's also interesting to see that it's baptism and the laying on of hands confer of the Holy Spirit, which give us the outline of our modern rites of baptism and confirmation. And that laying on of hands also for ministry, which becomes important, particularly in relation to the sacrament of holy orders. Once Paul leaves Ephesus, he travels quite widely through Macedonia and down into Achaia. That's after things have become controversial, because Paul spent quite a long time in Ephesus. He preaches in a synagogue and is warmly received and well received in a synagogue. But when it's going to become hard and unbelieving, Paul withdraws from the synagogue and goes to a meeting place instead. As Paul continues his time in Ephesus, then the silversmiths guild, under the leadership of Demetrius, stir up the crowds against Paul, because they see in Paul someone who is trying to take away their trade and their livelihood. Because the temple of Artemis was in Ephesus and was widely renowned for its silver work, and the silver work was a prominent feature of the city, and particularly of the temple of Artemis. And they can see in what Paul is doing that the temple of Artemis is no longer there. Their livelihoods are threatened. So in one sense it is protectionism of their own livelihood that prevents them from welcoming Paul's message. But not only do they not welcome Paul's message, but they stir up the crowds against him, to the point where it causes a riot. And it has to be quelled by the local officials. Once Paul leaves Ephesus and travels on, he travels back through Philippi, Thessalonica, Beroea, and down to Corinth once more, spending quite some time again in Corinth. It's probably about this time that he writes his letter to the Romans. Don't forget that, as we shall see, the community of believers in Rome wasn't founded by Paul, but was pre-existing, as we see in the presence of Aquila of Priscilla and Aquila as they meet him in Corinth on his first stay there. So Paul writes that letter to them there, and then travels back up through Achaia, Macedonia, and through to Miletus, a port town not far from Ephesus, which is where we meet Paul again on Tuesday in our readings. In Miletus, Paul summons the elders of the community of Ephesus in order to greet them one last time, because Paul has set his face resolutely for Jerusalem, just as Jesus had done in the Gospel. One of the things that we noticed this week in Luke's account of Paul's final journey from Miletus down to Jerusalem and then on trial and eventually to Rome is how closely it resembles the pattern of what happens to Jesus in the Gospel. That just as Jesus is tried unfairly, handed over to the authorities, so too will be believers. And this is seen in Paul's own life and in the way Luke tells Paul's story. Really, Paul gives a great resume of his life and ministry in his farewell speech to the elders at Ephesus. He talks about what God has done through him and how they need to continue in that belief. Paul also warns them of the dangers that will threaten them once he leaves. That fierce wolves will attack the church, sometimes even coming from within the community of believers. But they have to trust that God is with them, that God has promised them the Holy Spirit, who will stay with them in all things, guide them as the Spirit has guided Paul throughout his mission and his journey. And it's the Spirit of Jesus, the Spirit of God, who will safeguard that church and each of the churches that Paul has founded. Once Paul leaves there, he is determined to be back in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. He sails from Miletus and with a stop for a week in the port of Tyre so that the ship can unload, heads down to Caesarea, which is the nearest port to Jerusalem. Arriving in Caesarea, he goes to stay with the community and stay in the house of Philip, who we can see is one of the 7 deacons from the Greek community, who was commissioned to look after that Greek-speaking community, but also who we see going out and preaching the gospel in Samaria. The community gathered in Philip's house welcomed Paul with great joy. However, things do not always work themselves out, because we see that it is whilst there that predictions are growing more and more with gloominess, that all is not going to go well for Paul. The community resists these predictions, but it comes to a head when Prophet Agabus comes up from Jerusalem and stays with the community in Caesarea. Through a symbolic action of tying Paul's belt and leading him away, he shows what is going to happen to Paul when he comes to Jerusalem. The community is quite worried by this and urge Paul not to go into Jerusalem but to continue the journey elsewhere. Paul, however, is determined to head to Jerusalem. He wants the Lord's will to be done, and he sees that it's the Lord's will that he goes up to Jerusalem. The community, finding that they cannot persuade Paul out of this course of action, goes with what he says, asking that the Lord's will be done. In many ways, we see the patterns of Jesus with the predictions of his own passion, the disbelief of his disciples, and wanting to protect Jesus. We see also that in the Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples still don't quite get it, still don't really want things to be done. They're falling asleep, but Jesus is there praying in the garden, praying so hard that his sweat falls like drops of blood. But he prays at all times that the Lord's will, that his Father's will may be done. And this is what we see reflected in Paul, with that determination to go to Jerusalem, that just as Jesus suffered, Paul will suffer also for the name of the Lord. He's not afraid of doing this because he knows that Jesus has called him to his ministry and Jesus will be with him through whatever may happen. As we leave Wednesday and into Thursday, we see that Paul arrives in Jerusalem and is greeted warmly by the community. Meeting James and the elders, he is asked to spend some time helping some of the community to fulfill a vow that they have made. This essentially helps in Luke's narrative to provide the rationale that Paul has never abandoned his ancestral heritage. And we see that also in the circumcision of Timothy, that whilst it may look odd after the Council of Jerusalem, that Timothy ultimately was a Jew. And so too with these Jewish members of the community in Jerusalem, Paul is asked to help with paying for the offering for their purification at the end of the time of their vow. It is whilst Paul is in the temple doing this that some of the Jews from Asia who were opposed to Paul's mission and who stirred up trouble for him there cause a riot, because they declare that Paul has preached everywhere across the entire world against the law of Moses. And not only that, he has broken the custom and desecrated the temple by bringing a Gentile into it. At no point is there any suggestion that Paul had played down his ancestral heritage, or that he had brought a Gentile into the temple. The fact that the Asian Jews had seen him in a city earlier in the week with Trophimus, who is a Greek, does not mean that Paul was at him in the temple. It is just another convenient accusation that is levelled against him. But the mob is whipped up so much that Lysias, who is the tribune in Jerusalem, sends out the troops to go and haul Paul into the barracks and arrests him. The tribune thinks that he is actually an Egyptian revolutionary stirring up trouble against the Romans from within the very temple itself. Paul, however, asks to be able to speak to the crowd and gives the defence of his ministry, including telling how it was the God of their ancestors who had called Paul on the road in the person of Jesus, and asked him why he was persecuting the church, of which is his body. None of this really placates the crowd, but it allows Paul to make his defence, to make his apologia, as it is called, of all that he has done so far. After this, we hear that Paul is then tried by the Sanhedrin, which is the full ruling council of Israel, just as Jesus also had his hearing before the Sanhedrin. It is this that we get on Thursday morning in our readings. Here, the accusations are levelled against Paul, but they had been by the mob. And so Paul says that it is for the belief in the resurrection of the dead, which the Pharisee party held, that he is on trial. And this causes dispute between the Pharisees' party and the Sadducees' party. The Pharisees want to know, well, maybe an angel has spoken to Paul, or maybe a spirit has. They believe in the resurrection. But Paul wants them to believe that this resurrection in which they believe has happened, and has happened in Jesus. That God raised him from the dead in order that he might bring life to the whole world. The problem is that rather than seeing that this has happened, in essence the Pharisees' party end up against the Messianic community, because they don't ultimately go for the resurrection that's happening in Jesus. They almost inevitably end up siding with the other side, with the Sadducees. But whilst they disagree with them, they are still united in opposition against the message that Paul is preaching. It is the Spirit of Jesus, the Spirit of the risen Lord, who has animated Paul's ministry. It is that same Spirit that Paul wants them to see, not just any Spirit, but the Spirit of God, who has given Paul the boldness to speak out, has given Paul the opportunity to take his mission to the ends of the earth. In the end, Lysias pulls him out and sends him to Caesarea, to the Roman governor Felix. This is because a plot is uncovered after the trial, where some of the more zealot Jews would like to have killed Paul and get the support of the chief priests in doing this. Felix keeps Paul in custody and hears his case, but gives him relative freedom under a form of house arrest, that he cannot leave the compound of the Roman governor, but is free to come and go within it, and free to receive his companions there. Paul eventually remains there for 2 years, with Felix sending for him on a frequent basis to hear him. But when Paul gets into deeper topics such as judgment and the belief in Jesus as the basis for the judgment, Felix doesn't really want to know. He's not interested in that aspect of things, and each time sends Paul away again. Having heard of the collection that Paul had been gathering for the community in Jerusalem, which formed part of his defence, Felix is perhaps looking for a bribe as well. We know from external sources that Felix was not a popular Roman governor, one who was seen as corrupt. And this is evident in Luke's narrative in Acts of the Apostles. After 2 years, Felix is replaced by a new governor called Festus. As a favour to the Jews, Felix leaves Paul in custody in the compound. Festus, on his first visit to Jerusalem, is asked and strongly lobbied by the party of the chief priests to have Paul brought to Jerusalem for trial there. The idea is that those who had vowed not to eat or drink until Paul was killed in their vow, then these same people are still looking for that opportunity. Paul, when he is questioned by Festus as a Roman citizen, uses his right of appeal to Rome and says that he would like his case to be heard by Caesar rather than by the people in Jerusalem. On Friday, we then hear that King Herod Agrippa II is in town. So Festus uses the opportunity to have, in a sense, another show trial with Paul, because he gets Festus. Festus is there, King Herod Agrippa, and his sister, who Berenice. Don't forget, the king and the queen, his sister, are seen as being Jews, whilst also being Romans, and connected to the imperial family in Rome. Both of these facts make them ideally placed to share the credit or to share the blame if things don't go so well with sending Paul to Rome, or not sending him to Jerusalem for trial. Ultimately, Festus has got other people to point to say, well, the decision really was out of my hands once Paul appealed to Rome. Having had this trial where ultimately Paul explains once more in perhaps even greater detail than we have heard before in the narrative of the Acts of the Apostles about his call, showing greater understanding of what God has been doing throughout Paul's ministry, that ultimately all Paul gets in return is derision from Festus and mocking humour from Herod Agrippa. It's a shame because ultimately they see what Paul's message is. They know what Paul is preaching about, but don't want to entertain the message. It is sad in one sense that being able to see the message, they don't welcome it with their heart open. But it is a pattern we've seen time and again in Paul's preaching, that those who have their hearts open receive and welcome Paul's message, whilst those who don't are closed to it. Eventually, Paul is sent for trial in Rome. However, disaster strikes on the way as a ship that Paul is travelling in runs aground because it hits a storm in the Mediterranean Sea, which were quite common at the time, especially in the winter when Paul was being sent across. And so it ends up shipwrecked on the island of Malta. Whilst on the island, then Paul is bitten by a viper, and the locals begin to believe that he surely must be a murderer therefore. However, when Paul is unaffected by the viper's bite, they begin to wonder if he is a god who is amongst them. Paul, however, points out that it's not his power that has done this, but the power of the risen Jesus. At all points, Paul uses the opportunity to preach the gospel. We are reminded in particular of the end of St. Mark's Gospel, where it says, "You'll pick up poisonous snakes in your hand and be unharmed, and should you drink deadly poison, you will survive. This, in a sense, shows the power of the risen Jesus amongst the community, as we get a visible demonstration of in the attack by the viper on Paul. Whilst Paul is there, he is summoned to the house of a local noble who is sick and cures him. And then people bring many of their sick, those possessed by spirits, to Paul, and all of them are cured while on Malta. When eventually they can set sail again from Malta to Rome, they do so. And even on the outskirts of Rome, the community come to meet Paul with great rejoicing. When Paul is in Rome, as we hear on Saturday, then the Jewish community there, Paul goes to speak to first, as he has always done so, in each of the places where he stops. He goes to synagogue on the Sabbath day. Here in Rome, he speaks with the leaders of the community to begin with, who find that they have heard of the way, but do not know much about it, other than that it is being controversial in the other places. They also know that they've received no instructions from the chief priests in Jerusalem concerning it. Paul therefore is invited to a meeting to engage the whole community in it. Paul does this, and many people believe and many don't. However, perhaps the sad part is that all of them leave Paul's presence, arguing amongst themselves about the message that he has. Rather than welcoming and listening to Paul, it seems that they are once more beset by internal divisions. As they go out, Paul uses the prophet Isaiah to talk about the hardness of heart that they seem to have within them, and that is why they do not have that message. It's not because of the Lord's want, it's not because of Paul's preaching, but because of the hardness of heart that they cannot accept what is being preached to them that day. Paul remained in Rome for 2 years, uninterrupted in his preaching of the gospel. And that is how the Acts of the Apostles finishes. So we're left ultimately with many questions. What happens in Paul's trial? Is he tried straight away when he gets to Rome and then released? Does Paul stay the next 2 years under house arrest just with the one guard with people coming and going? Is Paul allowed to go out to the synagogue or to other places to preach the gospel? Ultimately, why does Luke not tell us about what happens to Paul eventually? Does he have a second trial in which he's convicted and sentenced to death and martyrdom? But realistically, Luke is not really interested in those facts, because Luke in his narrative has achieved his objective. Just as in the Gospel, Jesus tells us it will be wrong for a prophet to die outside of Jerusalem, and so therefore sets his face resolutely forward. For Luke, he wants to show how post-Pentecost the church begins to grow and spread across the whole world, and to the very ends of the earth. With Paul arriving in Rome, the other details about Paul's final days are not really very important, because the gospel has spread to the centre of the empire and will continue to spread from there to the ends of the earth, so that all people may come to know what God has done for us in the death and resurrection of Jesus. This was always Luke's aim, that through the preaching starting off in Jerusalem, spreading out through the environs near Jerusalem into Samaria, and then out beyond there into Asia and into Europe, through the apostles and through Paul, through various other characters that we meet along the way. The gospel has reached the centre of the known world. In many ways, we see Pentecost as the birth of the church, so it can be in some ways quite odd that we read the Acts of the Apostles between Easter and Pentecost. But they're all to show us and to remind us that the Acts of the Apostles is the acts of the Holy Spirit in the early church, how the church begins to grow and to spread. Because when we come to Pentecost, we know that it is our story then. Because really, ultimately, the Acts of the Apostles is our story. It's the story of the church continuing today. It's the story of the church in the many corners of the world, when and that's in Wythenshawe, in Manchester, further afield across the north of England, or indeed in Europe, Asia, Africa, wherever the gospel is preached today, that is where the Holy Spirit is at work in the church. And that is the call to which we are summoned in the Feast of Pentecost, for which we are preparing.